controversial would pop up, she'd allow someone else to kind of take point, even if they were a political rival, especially if they were a political rival. And they'd have their moment in the sun, and then if something went sideways, it was their fault, and she would just step back and the public furor would close in around them. They'd be removed from the scene. She did this over and over and over in her decade-plus time, and it meant that German policy wasn't particularly dynamic, but it became more and more cohesive as time went on. And for Merkel's terms, they were basically living in a golden age, but they avoided dealing with the really big problems, and that's led to the problems Germany has today. With Bill Clinton, it was somewhat similar, but instead of letting rivals take lead, he basically followed the opinion polls. And since the United States was in an era in the 1990s where we didn't really care about foreign policy, that means foreign policy was almost non-existent. He was smart, so he would kind of cram for the test whenever we had a summit, and he was great in working a room, great in small group settings. He could connect with anyone, even enemies. But there wasn't a lot of follow-up because the American people really weren't interested. And so for 8 years, our foreign policy was static to calm, and that eventually contributed to the world that we are in today. All right, that's it on Bill. Next up, W. Hello, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the National Art Museum, which I thought was a great backdrop to talk about the brainiest cabinet we've ever had, which was that of George W. Bush. Now, W was a very atypical president by really any standards. He came from Texas, and the Texas Constitution prevents the Texas legislature from meeting for more than a month every other year, and it's constitutionally prohibited from considering legislation for the first half of that time. So the governor isn't so much a governor as an off-hours security guard who's responsible for making a few things happen that the local legislature says, and then making sure that not so much the trains run on time because there aren't trains because there's really no functional government, but just making sure that things don't fall apart and bringing things to offer up to the next legislature when they meet. Texas has the weakest government of any of the American states, and that is both a blessing or a curse based on what you're after. It has no funding, really. There is a state sales tax, but most taxes are raised at the local level in the form of property taxes and are then decided upon and spent at the local level. There is no state income tax. So often the governor is restricted to going for indirect supports of revenue, and so they basically shop around their no tax status to other states that are in financial duress and attract companies to Texas. It's a very successful economic model in the post-World War II era, but I wouldn't call it a governing model. And so when W came in, he was probably the best president we've ever had at bringing people together from all over the place to exchange views, but he didn't have a lot of experience in actually saying this is what needs to happen, we need to use the tools of government to do it. So he relied on his people to do that for him. And if you look at the cabinet, especially on the foreign affairs side, Condoleezza Rice, Bill Gates, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, you might not like them personally, you might not like their politics, but you gotta admit that they were some of the brightest people in the United States at the time when it came to being aware of the world. And a little bit like Reagan, W let them loose. Discussions were free-ranging and a little wild, very Texan, and then they were given authority to go out and use the tools of government as they largely saw fit to push this or that policy. And when they all came in, they were all convinced that it was time to recover from the Clinton era of non-engagement with the world and reshape the world for the post-Cold War era, to overhaul the American defense institutions so that by the time they were done 8 years later, we would have jumped a technological generation and been 30, 40, 50, 60 years technologically ahead of any potential competitor, and to reshape global institutions to serve American interests and enshrine democracy, individual rights, free market economics on a global scale for the next generation to come. They were making a lot of progress on that in the first year. Remember, this was started in 2001, so Vladimir Putin had not descended into this narcissistic, genocidal dictator that he's become now, and he was actually at the time fairly pro-Western, was open to the idea of an American-led world of which Russia would be a constructive part. China was under a guy by the name of Jiang Zemin who understood fully how the Chinese system was dependent on American overwatch and trade access. So there were some tussles with both, but they had not really reached the level where there was a point of no return. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and any plan that the W administration may have had for reshaping the world changed. And the occupation with and by the Middle East began. And all of a sudden, W's management style went from one that encouraged creativity and initiative to one that generated stasis, deadlock, and bad decisions. Because W personally did not have the experience to make big decisions on a lot of the issues of the day. He relied on his people to do that. And once they were given their orders, they would go out and use the tools of the government in order to make it happen. But since we didn't have a strong leader with a unified vision, each individual subordinate would carry out the orders how they saw fit, and the orders ultimately originated with them, which meant we got conflicting claims and conflicting policy for pretty much the last 6 years of the W administration, and W didn't really take the initiative to shift it because that's not how he ruled. Now, when he did have an idea, he was perfectly capable of assigning it to someone, and a lot of our policies on global health and Africa are to Bush's credit. But when it came to the big national security issues, he just didn't have the ability to ride herd. And that ultimately was what contributed to the failure of the Iraq mission and the extension of the Iraq mission and the complete destruction of the W administration because of the Iraq mission. Okay, that's it for W. Next up, Barack Obama. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C., which I thought would be a great backdrop for the next of this leadership series on American presidents and world leaders. The topic today is Barack Obama, who, in my opinion, is the third smartest president the United States has ever had after Jefferson and Clinton. That doesn't mean he was successful. Barack Obama was the first leader in the post-World War II era to really not come from a party. He campaigned on his personal charisma. He had never had what we would consider a grown-up job. He was the junior senator from Illinois, and aside from being a constitutional law professor, really hadn't had a big boy job until that point. And it shows in his management skills. Before becoming president, the biggest thing he'd ever done is manage his own campaign, which had a staff of like 16 when he was running for Senate the first time. In that sort of environment, when you suddenly inherit the American government apparatus with a staff of several million, he was wildly out of his depth, and more important, he wasn't interested in the job once he got it. Being president means managing, and that means communicating with people. And while he was wildly intelligent, he didn't really care to be around others. So when he absorbed his briefs, he would read them. He rarely asked questions. He might submit questions to an agency for a written brief, but he really didn't interact with the people who put it together. So he built up his raw intelligence and his understanding of a situation in a way